I've bent the clasps on your last project here, project number 9. And you can see that there's space between the tips of the tags of the clasps and the palette of the model. Over here, there's the clasp. Retentive tip is in the undercut. I like to bring the clasps along just to the linguals of the teeth, because that's where the acrylic tends to be the thickest. A lot of people like to bring the retentive tags so they come down into the palette. Not my favorite if there's any edentulous space. Over here we don't have any edentulous space, so I've brought the tag down into the palette. I've designed this with a full palette, so I'm going to be putting in a post dam like you learned in your denture class. The post dam is going to go from hamular notch to hamular notch. It'll go just a millimeter anterior to the palatine fovea, and on either side there'll be the posterior nasal spine. On the midline there's going to be a little depression on either side. So let's do that first. Scrape along the posterior border of my post dam. Just pop the clasp off. Not the best idea. This would have been better to do before I put the clasps on. So scrape along the posterior border. This is only a shallow scrape. It's 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter deep. And then here in the center of where you're going to have your little depression, I'm going to make this about 2 millimeters deep there, and I'll make it about 2 millimeters deep here, in the center of the depression on the other side. And then from there, I'm going to bevel it forward. So that what I end up with is a gradually reducing depression on either side. So the post dam is about 2 millimeters deep here in the center of each of the depressions, and then it comes out and it gets gradually shallower as it comes anterior, shallower as it goes to the midline, and shallower as it goes to the lateral. Okay, let's just put the clasp back on. We're going to be waxing this up like you do with your full dentures, and so I'm waxing the clasps into the palette. Later I'm going to be drilling a round indexing hole above and below each clasp as we did previously, and then sprinkling orthoacrylic over the wire, and that's going to bond and matrix the wire to the model so that it doesn't fall out at any point while we're doing the heat cure processing. I don't have the teeth that you guys have. I have a different type of teeth here. It just happened to be what I had in the lab. So I'm now going to do the setup here for the 3. We're missing the 4, 5, 6. And just a check you can do is the size of the teeth. The teeth should basically fit the gap you've got. If your teeth fit the gap, then it's a good size. As you guys learned in your dentures class, the teeth come on a card. The mold of the teeth on the one side of the card, the shade of the teeth on the other side. This is a posterior 1x8, which is one set of 8 teeth. On the posterior teeth, the number of the mold, 33, means that it's 33 millimeters from the mesial of the 4 to the distal of the 7. An M, meaning that these are a medium length tooth, so you can get a short tooth or a long tooth, but 99% of the time we'll use an M, a medium tooth. The teeth come in a, this is Kenson tooth, so the teeth generally come in a 29 millimeters, 31 millimeters, and 33 millimeters for the length, or for the size of the teeth. Okay, so what I'm going to do, we have to place the teeth over the wires here. To get the tooth to fit over the wire, I just can't take the tooth and stick it there because it's going to interfere with the wire. I mean, the wire's in the way, and I don't want to just put the tooth behind the wire. What we want to do is we want to create a little pocket in the tooth here so that the tooth fits around the wire. Obviously, not something that you have to worry about when we're doing full dentures, but for partial dentures, this is what we want to do. So I will try to stay in camera as I do this. Okay. So the first thing that I'm going to do, so that I don't muck up my burrs, is I just get a piece of paper towel, and, or whatever, I mean, if I don't have a piece of paper towel, I do it on the arm of my lab coat. And I'm going to take the wax off that's on the carding wax that's on the lingual of that tooth. The burr that I'm going to use, for the most part, I'm just going to use a round burr here, because I'm trying to make a pocket for the wire, and I want it to be like a little pocket where the wire fits in the tooth. I don't want to just grind the whole tooth away. I only want to do adjustments where the tooth interferes with the wire. So I'll kind of stick the tooth on there, and I can see that the mesial of the tooth is going to be, the mesial of the tooth is where the wire is where the mesial of the tooth wants to be. And this tooth, particularly this 4, which is the most anterior of these teeth, I want to snuggle that in to the tooth anterior of it as well as I can. So I'm going to take my round burr, and I'm just going to hollow out the mesial of this tooth a little bit. Okay. Don't go wild. Don't do a whole bunch at a time. Do a little bit. Make sure you're in the right place. So you can see that that's fitting a little bit better now. Okay. You want to take a look under the tooth also and make sure that the tooth's not just sitting right on top of the wire. Sometimes you have to cut away a little on the bottom of the tooth there for where the wire goes. And if I take a look over here, it's not too bad. What you can find is that, I'm just looking for a smaller round burr. Yeah, smaller. Okay, so what you can find is that you're fitting okay, but here the wire is, or the mesial of the tooth there is interfering with the wire. So if you can position the tooth at approximately the height that you want the tooth to be there, so it's about sitting at the right height. I'll make a little pencil mark just because I like pencils. Okay, so my wire for the clasp is interfering, or the tooth is interfering with the wire of the clasp. The wire of the clasp is sitting about there. I don't want to use my great big round burr because that'll make a big hole in the tooth. But what I'm going to do is use a slightly smaller round burr, and I'm just going to break through. I'm just going to break through the mesial buccal of the tooth just a little bit there, so that when I put the tooth on, the wire just snuggles into that little cut that I've made in the tooth there. So well, that's now fitting reasonably well there. I actually made my preparation a little bit big back here. I didn't have to make it quite that big. C'est la vie. I'm going to just round down this corner a little bit. There's a very sharp corner there where I made the preparation. So yeah, that's looking pretty reasonable. Now, if we had an opposing model and everything, we would, put this in the articulator and check it with the bite and the opposing model. We don't have an opposing model for these teeth for you to set up, but if you have an opposing model, there's two ways that people go about setting the teeth if they've got the opposing. Some people will set the tooth so that it looks good, it looks like it's in the right place, and then grind the tooth against the opposing model to check the bite. Other people will stick the tooth in so that it's in a relatively good position in the bite. So they may stick the tooth higher in the case of a maxillary tooth like this. They would stick it closer to the model so it looks short in relation to the other teeth, so they don't have to trim the tooth as much. Which one is the best method? I guess it's up to you. Each of you is going to, for every case and for every practitioner, there's going to be a better answer. So very much like doing your denture setups, just set your tooth to match the other teeth, and then notice that while I was talking, I grabbed the wrong tooth, and I've put the 5 in the 4 position. And the patient is going to be extremely upset like that, with that, because patients are very, very picky about things like that, as are instructors. But chances are, if I didn't say anything, no one will notice. Second tooth here doesn't really have any wires in the way too much, so we'll just put a little bit of wax. When I'm doing a setup, I always use the minimum amount of wax. We talked about this previously in your quadrant setup exercise. Having a lot of wax in a setup doesn't do you any favors with the setup. It just makes it more difficult. When you're setting a tooth, you want to be able to make sure that you can soften all of the wax which is around the tooth. Otherwise, the wax is determining where the tooth goes, not you. Okay. And now our molar, I'll make sure I grab the first molar. Although, that being said, let's see how the first molar fits. So our first molar goes in. It's a little bit big. I'm going to have to trim the first molar a bit, and I'll do that because this is a video about showing you how to fit the tooth in there. But in a case, I might take a look at that and decide, well, looky there, the 7 fits much better with less adjustment. And again, a patient, the doctor would never know, the patient would never know. It's going to function just as well. There's absolutely no reason, if it's going to fit better, that you don't use the 7 there, because what you're going to end up with is a whole tooth, or a wholer tooth, that you haven't had to trim the hell out of in order to get it to fit. I always find it irritating when somebody trims down a tooth so much that you lose the shape of the tooth, and you can't, you can hardly see the tooth in the little sliver that's left, when they could have just used a smaller tooth and ended up with a much better looking result. But in this case, I will torment myself and use the proper the tooth for the proper position. So what I'm going to have to do here is I'm going to have to reduce a little bit. Now, I can reduce the distal of the 5 a little bit also. I don't have to take all of the reduction. Doesn't have to come off of my 6 here, because as I said, you can end up with making your 6 look terrible if you take too much off of it. So I can take my 5 and reduce a little bit on the distal of the 5. Anyway, I don't usually do that while it's in the wax, because I don't want to get wax on my burr, because wax on your burr is never a good thing. I'm just going to take a little off the mesial. I'm not just going to take a huge chunk off the distal. I'm going to take some off the mesial also. Again, it's about trying to preserve a bit of the shape of the tooth, not just taking this big huge chunk off of the distal to make it fit. Okay, and now I'm going to take a chunk out of the distal. So notice that I try to stay below this distal marginal ridge here. I try not to cut through the marginal ridge and into the occlusion. I try to cut down here on the proximal ridge lap to make the space that I need for the wire. And we'll see how much I have to reduce of the tooth in order to get it to fit. So I'm going to have to take 1.5 millimeters, 2 millimeters off the distal of the tooth there to get the tooth to fit, and sit down. I'm not just doing this straight across the tooth. I'm still trying to keep the tooth with a little bit of shape. The teeth are rounded, they're not square. Okay, getting closer. Running into the wire there. Take out a little more of a pocket. If I make the pocket a little too big here, it's not a big deal, because it's just going to get filled in with the acrylic when you process. Getting closer. Break through the distal buckle there slightly. And let's soften up the wax and see if we've got a fit. Was sitting on that piece of wax there, so reduce the piece of wax, and not so bad. We can get it back. Need to take it a little bit more lingually. To take it lingually, I'm going to have to adjust the ridge lap here on the distal proximal. I'm also going to have to adjust in here. I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but where the wire is rising there is interfering with the tooth. The tooth is running into the wire. Well, yeah, I think I can get away with. If I look through here, it looks better. So I think I can get away with just doing some reduction to the ridge lap here. Flap out a little bit. I don't really want to shorten the tooth. And what's happening is that my tooth is pushing the clasp down, so I'm going to have to take a little bit more here. So I've just made the tooth is now just a little shell there to allow it to sit over the clasp. Let's put a little more wax on the clasp here. That'll help to hold the clasp in place. Okay, we're getting pretty good there, so I can put a little bit of wax there and stick this tooth down, and then we're going to be ready to go do some wax up. So I'm going to try and show you what the tooth looks like. Okay, so you can see how I've hollowed out that distal of the tooth where it fits over the clasp. And that means that the clasp wire is going to be hidden inside the tooth. In general, we don't want the tooth to be sticking up through, we don't want the wire to be sticking up through the tooth. And so we end up with something that looks like that. Okay. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time adjusting this on camera for you. what I'm going to do is go over and start the wax up. We'll do the wax up, and once the wax up is done, which is the same process as you're using for your full dentures, it's the same wax up, except that you've already got the teeth over here, so you're going to finish it the way we finished our acrylic on your cold cure partials. The big difference in this, because we're doing a heat cure, is going to be in how you flask it. And that's going to be the end of the project for you in this, because if you've done the flasking properly, then it's just process and trim the way that you would a complete denture, and pretty much the way that you've done for your cold cure dentures.